Hello everyone! Today we're chatting about this electrohydraulic hacksaw called Casto VBS202. It was made back in the 70s and seems to have had a pretty rough life since. It's supposed to be a lot wider to support materials, but previous owner has chopped it apart. This is how it's supposed to look. A neighbor gave me this for free because it wasn't working. The saw blade moves back and forth, but has apparently been more and more resistant to lowering the saw blade, until one day it stopped completely. I've never worked on a machine like this, so I started disassembling anything I could get to in an attempt to understand it. More and more parts coming off without understanding much or seeing any real issues with the functions. But everything is really disgusting. This drive gear is a good example. There's been a lot of cleaning just to find the fasteners to take things apart. This motor was quite interesting. It's two motors in one, and each motor can be run at 2 speeds, so it's a dual speed motor. Eventually I decided to take the machine outside and pressure wash it. I think it wasn't until this point I decided to really overhaul this thing. I sanded all painted surfaces and ground down some casting defects from factory. On with epoxy primer and polyurethane paint. Being an amateur, I managed to get some horrible runs in the paint, so after letting it harden for a few days, I started sanding everything down again. My second try at painting was much more successful. A big part of it was down to being more careful when tuning the spray gun. Even the homemade legs got some paint splashed on them. At this point, I'm already getting pretty excited, having no idea how much work is left to do. I took the cylinders that used to protrude from the side and cut them down to length. This felt like a neater solution than leaving big gaping holes. I also gave the side support a makeover in the milling machine, as it looked pretty messed up. Here's the cylinders and side support reinstalled. About that motor. It looked a lot better just from washing it off, but I decided to clean it properly and also repaint it. I also split it both to get better access and also check the bearings out. One of the heat sinks had received some damage, so I decided to sand it down flush instead. Everything cleaned up and somewhat reassembled, time for paint. This paint laid on great, but for some reason started cracking after just a few weeks. Not sure what I did wrong. I mounted the motor back on the frame for now. Time to tackle the hinged part of the sawing assembly. Quite a lot of rags went into cleaning this up. I sanded it down and applied the same epoxy primer as before. I laid the primer on pretty thick so I can sand it down a bit afterwards. This seems to give the best results when it's finally time for the polyurethane paint. Same goes for the side cover of the hacksaw frame. And the hacksaw frame. And the bearing support for the hinged part. Getting the hinged part back on the base was a challenge. It's quite heavy and needs to be persuaded on from the side at a very specific angle, without chafing the paint. You can see one of the big bearings here that lets it smoothly hinge up and down. With that back in place, I turned to the hydraulics, which I understood absolutely nothing of. Slowly picking things apart to look for obvious faults. Eventually I found this little seal, or what used to be a seal, around the main rod. Having replaced the seal and checked everything out, I started reassembly. This involved quite a bit of gasket making. Putting the gasket material against the part and using a dirty glove as a marker works surprisingly well. This is what I refer to as the main hydraulic unit. At least the mid and lower half is currently sitting upside down. Then you have this oil reservoir. I need to clean up the fill hole since the threads were a bit messed up. The 2 nozzles on the side are for return lines from the main hydraulic unit, whilst the yellow brass ring is where the oil will go up into the main unit and piston. With the lid loosely placed on top, you have the yellowish solenoid valve on the right. This opens when the saw is done to release the pressure and raise the saw blade. The nozzle on the left is the return path from the piston. Depending on how hard you set the cutting pressure, it will allow more or less oil to return its way, thus regulating the down pressure on the saw blade. With the lid removed again, here's the hollow main piston and a smaller rod that slides within it and affects a smaller piston. Here's the smaller piston that runs inside the bigger piston. I believe this is the actual oil pump. It has heavy springs on one side and gets pushed in from the other side by the previously shown smaller rod. I spent a lot of time looking at schematics, trying to piece this thing back together. Eventually I managed to get it right and started masking anything sensitive off with tape. Then a proper cleanup, on with primer and paint and back on with a thick spring that helps it return. This spring is so heavy I had to resort to the hydraulic press just to keep it in position until I could lock it down. Now this is the main drive gear. If you look at the second bearing from the top, you can see it's offset from the others. This is what pushes on the smaller rod inside the main piston rod and pumping the oil into the main piston. I decided to take all bearings off the shaft, both for easier condition check and also to clean them up and push new grease through. I ended up only having to replace one of these bearings luckily. The part on the right sits on the first and third bearing from the right, and the main piston rod then screws into the threaded parts. This keeps the smaller rod constrained against the oval part, which is the second bearing from the right in this photo. After this, the epic struggle of getting the whole assembly back in started. I ended up making a jig just so I could carefully pressure it back in. Then comes this drive shaft. The small gear connects to the big gear and the other end gets a belt pulley. You can see the shiny shaft protruding on the left. And this is where the main piston rod screws in. Before I put the saw blade frame back on, I decided to overhaul the spring that helps hold it up. This had sat down in all the disgusting goo I cleaned up and was completely seized up. After a lot of convincing, I managed to get it apart and cleaned up. Sadly, the springs has broken in several places, but I fit as much back in as I could. With that quick overhaul, I installed both the hydraulics and the assist spring, which also lets me install the saw blade frame without risking it falling down. By now I'm getting really excited to see the thing run. I mentioned a cutting pressure adjustment a while back. This is it. The spiral pushes that cylinder in, limiting the return flow more and more. And here it is fully installed. Time to tackle the vise. It used to have this big ugly case around the crank, since it also used to have a motor that would close the vise. And I decided to cut it down in the lathe. It was quite unbalanced, so it made my small lathe wiggle a little bit. You can really see the size difference here. I really disliked the old handle. It was super light and felt cheap. Digging through the scraps, I found this old flange which I bored out and cut a keyway into. Comparing it to the old, and it just feels so much better. At the same time, I had painted the big belt pulley and vice jaws and started reinstalling them. And the belt cover. The new vice handle slides down a bit further on the shaft so I could lessen the stick out, less risk of walking into it. Still some way to go, but starting to look like a proper machine now. Finally, it was time for the circuit box. This is full of stuff that's not used anymore since a previous owner cut the machine in half. I decided to repurpose everything and make it smaller. Good opportunity to practice fabrication, if nothing else. The new box would be too low for buttons, so I decided to do an elevated control panel. I've noticed throughout this project that I will take any excuse to play with the mill. Here I'm cutting out space for a removable lid on the control box, eventually ending up here. I started test fitting the levers and buttons, speed selector in the front, and on, off and down feed buttons on top. I wanted it to be automated, so I started figuring out how to install limit switches. This round bit was already at the optimal location, so all I needed was a box with switches on a hinge. When the saw is at the bottom, it pulls the rod up, hitting the top switch. As it comes back to the top, the rod moves down, hitting the bottom switch. Compare this to the old panel. This is almost everything that was needed to make it run now. I added 2 more relays after this picture to invert some functions, but that's about it. A much bigger challenge was the speed selector that I managed to mess up the wiring on. It has 32 screw terminals and needs 18 wires to it and a bunch of jumpers. Luckily, I managed to get help on a forum and drew this schematic up to aid me in the future. With the box now painted, things are real close to the finish line. I was quickly going to install the cutting fluid pump, which I didn't think would work. For some reason, I did not consider what would happen if it did work. Yeah. Here it is, finally installed in the bottom of the base, which is filled with cutting fluid. It sits elevated on some stands, so it doesn't suck from the bottom of the tank. And there's also some guards to stop ships from getting sucked in at the bottom. Here's the back of the machine, Final wiring to the motors and limit switches. Control panel with obligatory crooked labels. Cutting fluid nozzles. And cutting pressure adjustment. Let's finally watch it cut something. This is the slowest speed setting it has, and first time I'm ever cutting anything harder than plastic, so I'm being very careful. From start to end of the cut, it took around 4 minutes. This is also with 2 out of 9 on the cutting pressure. Once it hits the bottom limit switch, it starts going back up and turns off once it returns to the top limit switch. Cutting the same piece at speed 2 out of 4 here, still only 2 out of 9 on cutting pressure. From start to end of cut, it was 2 minutes. Quite a good time improvement. Overall, I'm super happy with the results and really looking forward to using this machine more. Thanks for watching, please leave a comment or consider subscribing if you like my content. Bye!